Nowadays, things which were once considered part of nerd culture are now accepted in the mainstream. After all, the masses can't get enough of superhero movies, and Star Wars is back in theaters. But amidst all of these successes, there are bound to be a few flops. We'll show you some movies that were huge disappointments at the box office. First, grab your popcorn and hit subscribe for more videos from CBR. Now let's get started.
Thought we were in trouble there for a second, but it's fine. We're fine.
Solo: A Star Wars Story. In theory, Solo: A Star Wars Story should have been box office gold. It features a plot based on probably the most popular member of the entire Star Wars franchise, Han Solo, add in an all-star cast including Donald Glover as Lando Calrissian, and you'd think that people would be lining up around the block for this movie. Because of this, many people worried about the fact that Deadpool 2 was being released so perilously close to the big and highly anticipated Star Wars film. How would this relatively new franchise compete with Star Wars? During its opening weekend, Deadpool took in over $125 million. 1 week later, Solo: A Star Wars Story hit theaters on Memorial Day weekend. It took in only $84 million the first weekend it opened in the United States, and overseas, things were just as dismal. It premiered everywhere except for Japan and brought in only $65 million total. In China alone, it only took in $10.1 million. Deadpool 2 director David Leitch claims that he tried not to let the fear of opening up next to a movie about Han Solo get to him. He and Ryan Reynolds tried to keep in mind that they were making very different movies and keep their eyes on the prize. Apparently, it paid off, since the success of Deadpool 2 further illustrated what an absolute box office flop Solo is turning out to be.
Come with me if you want to live.
Terminator Genisys. After waiting ages for another addition to the beloved Terminator franchise, we were over the top excited to hear about the release of Terminator Genisys. Not only would we witness the return of the great Arnold Schwarzenegger, but many other great and beloved sci-fi and fantasy actors. This includes Mother of Dragons and beloved fantasy actor Emilia Clarke as Sarah Connor, and 11th Doctor Matt Smith in a cameo. However, the film was such a massive box office disaster that it caused Paramount to drop any plans they might have had in mind for a sequel. Like Solo, it also came out near another highly anticipated movie, Jurassic World, which made $209 million its opening weekend. Terminator Genisys, the fifth film in the franchise, grossed only $28.7 million in the first 3 days it opened. By the end of the 5-day holiday weekend, it had taken in only $44.2 million. However, it wasn't a total flop overseas, and managed to gross $350 million internationally at the end of the day. However, with its sky-high production costs, and after having been stuck in development hell, it hardly seemed worth it.
Ride ain't over yet.
My man.
Justice League. With the Avengers and its cast of Marvel superheroes doing so well, it's easy to see why DC would want a piece of that pie. Their answer to the classic, how do we throw together a great team of superheroes question was Justice League. Except they got the answer so wrong that their pencil exploded and their test caught on fire. Unlike some of the other flops in this video, most people didn't expect Justice League to be a total smash hit. They just hoped it would do well enough to justify doing similar movies in the future, which would hopefully be more successful. But needless to say, that wasn't the case. It did worse than the worst estimates, taking in $95 million domestically. This disastrous opening weekend was the worst in the previous 5-year history of DC Universe films. And yes, this includes the money made from Batman v Superman: Dawn of Justice and Man of Steel. Although Batman v Superman was a higher grossing film, it was pretty heavily criticized. Because of that, most people weren't on the edges of their seat to see the latest DC movie, which likely hurt the success of Justice League. Go figure.
I have more in common with a dog than I have with you.
I love dogs. I've always loved dogs.
Jupiter Ascending. While some people may have been expecting Justice League not to be a huge success, Jupiter Ascending looked much more promising. The Wachowskis were involved, and you may remember them as having had hands in successful films such as the Matrix series and V for Vendetta. They set the bar really high for themselves, but it came crashing down when this movie hit theaters in 2015. It contained a ton of big-name actors like Mila Kunis, Channing Tatum, and Sean Bean. In addition to signing paychecks for the cast, a ton of money was spent on the visual effects. Entire worlds needed to be created since it takes place in outer space, and that's not even taking into account the extensive makeup, prosthetics, and costumes. The film had a budget of $176 million, meaning that it really needed to do well. Unfortunately, as you may have guessed, it didn't. Not only did it receive extremely negative reviews from critics, but it made slightly over $47 million domestically. There was an additional $136.6 million grossed overseas, but it still wasn't enough. After the film's budget and all of the marketing costs, it's estimated that this movie lost Warner Brothers about $80 million.
Not bad, huh? You're a superhero.
Green Lantern. We know, we all want to pretend that Green Lantern was never made. Don't worry, so does Ryan Reynolds. But because it's one of the absolute worst box office flops ever, we are obligated to mention it. Before he starred as the Merc with a Mouth in Deadpool and Deadpool 2, Ryan Reynolds played the titular character in Green Lantern. He believes that the problem with the movie was that nobody could figure out exactly what it was supposed to be. In comparison, Deadpool had a clear vision shared by a lot of people working on the movie, and the marketing department was completely on board. But Green Lantern was a confusing mess, and audiences didn't know what to expect based on the promo before the movie came out. Not only has Ryan Reynolds proven that he has what it takes to play a superhero, but Greg Berlanti of Arrow fame also worked on the project. The budget for Green Lantern was $200 million, which didn't include the substantial cost to market it. In order for it to be considered a commercial success, it would have had to have grossed over $500 million, and it didn't come anywhere close to that. Worldwide, it took in less than half of that with $219.8 million.
Maybe I ought to get behind you.
John Carter. The theatrical release of John Carter was such a disappointment that the movie became a cautionary tale in Hollywood. It tells the frightening story of what can happen when you dump a whole bunch of cash into a movie and end up losing hundreds of millions of dollars. Honestly, as bad as this movie was, in all fairness, it was pretty much set up to fail from the get-go. It was obscenely expensive to produce, with a budget of $350 million and an additional $100 million spent to market it. When you spend $450 million to get a movie out there, obviously the stakes are a bit high. In order for it to be profitable, it would have had to smash all sorts of box office records. Well, the good news was that it did break some records when it hit theaters. John Carpenter actually had the biggest opening weekend in Russia, and the second biggest opening weekend for a Disney film in China. However, let's just say it fell slightly short of its $600 million goal. In total, it grossed only $284 million worldwide. 47 Ronin. From Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure to John Wick, Keanu Reeves is an actor who has been in many incredible films. There's no denying that he's resplendent in both talent and star power, but that's not enough to make a movie success. Even he was unable to save the box office flop that was the movie 47 Ronin. It had a pretty high budget, with $175 million spent on the movie itself and a further $50 million spent on marketing and distribution. Unfortunately, the movie release just kept getting pushed back, and it ended up facing extremely stiff competition. When facing up against movies like The Hobbit, The Desolation of Smaug, The Wolf of Wall Street, and Anchorman 2: The Legend Continues, it didn't exactly come out on top. Opening weekend, it grossed a paltry $9.9 million domestically, and the movie didn't do better overseas. Not only were people not lining up to see it, those who sat through it absolutely hated it. Domestically, it only grossed about $38 million, and in total, it brought in $151 million worldwide. This was a meager sum, especially considering how much the movie cost to create and distribute.
You were bred for this. You see things in a way we can't.
Ender's Game. When it was announced that there would be a movie based on the book Ender's Game by Orson Scott Card, tons of people were thrilled. This book was part of an epic series, and the thought of seeing it on the big screen seemed like a dream come true. This was a classic science fiction book, but it had been published way back in 1985. In order to be successful as a movie, it really needed to be marketed carefully. To people unfamiliar with the story, we can see how it would be a bit off-putting. It's a big-budget film which takes place in space and involves children fighting in a war. It sounds pretty strange, if not more than a little bit grim. At least when we watch The Hunger Games, most of the kids we see are supposedly in their teens. Based on the demographics of audience members, it seems that people who read and enjoyed the book indeed turned out to watch the movie. But the problem is that nobody else did. For a movie that took about $110 million to make, it only grossed $61.7 million.
You have to shoot around your boy! It's easier to shoot through him. No!
The Adventures of Pluto Nash. There's no denying that actor Eddie Murphy has had a successful career. In 2015, he was named the 6th highest grossing actor in the United States. But this doesn't mean he doesn't have a few flops under his belt, and one in particular stands out amongst the rest. Yes, we're talking about The Adventures of Pluto Nash. In addition to the esteemed Eddie Murphy, this film also involved Randy Quaid, Rosario Dawson, and John Cleese. The film was supposed to be an action comedy, but in reality it didn't really contain much of either element. Not only was the movie itself critically panned, but there was a huge lack of press screenings. So people either saw it and hated it, or never even considered seeing it at all because they didn't know what it was about. During its opening weekend, it only brought in an embarrassing $2.1 million. The film had a budget of about $100 million, but after all was said and done, it only brought in about $7.1 million. No, we aren't exaggerating, it really just made over $7 million. That is a 93% loss. Whew, no wonder this movie is considered one of the biggest box office failures of all time.
Justice is what I seek.
The Lone Ranger. There are some movies that just seemed destined to fail, and The Lone Ranger was one of them. Western movies are a hard sell in the first place, but when you add in the fact that this was a high-budget and high-concept movie, it really didn't stand a chance. Just look at similar films such as Wild Wild West and Cowboys and Aliens. Consider how well those movies did, and then imagine deciding to spend $375 million producing and marketing a similar film. Well, that's exactly what Disney did when it decided to put together The Lone Ranger. Because of the sky-high budget, the film would have needed to pull in over $650 million to be considered a success. That is a huge risk, and in this case, it definitely didn't pay off in the slightest. It barely made a third of that amount, grossing about $260.5 million worldwide. This means that Disney took a hit of approximately $150 million on this ill-conceived idea for a movie. Sure, it starred Johnny Depp and Armie Hammer, and was directed by Gore Verbinski of Pirates of the Caribbean fame. This just wasn't enough to save it.
Class dismissed.
Were you surprised to see any of these movies on our list of unsuccessful films? Or did you totally see them all coming? Let us know what you think in the comments section below, and then click on that subscribe button to get more videos from CBR. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time.